Good morning, everyone. Today is Thursday, November 16th. We're coming up on Thanksgiving in a week, and I hope that everybody is looking forward to a little bit of a respite from what has been, I think, in my experience, one of the most difficult 6 weeks in memory. And that won't change because it is Thanksgiving next week, but perhaps you will still find time to hug people you love and sit around a table that is abundant with nutrition and good feelings, and that you can give thanks for the simple blessing of being alive and having reached this season. So let's join together in a bracha. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. With apologies for last week's canceled study on account of internet connectivity issues on my end. We return to where we were supposed to be. I've prepared a lesson for today that stays on theme for those of you who are following us sequentially, either in real time or catching up with the recordings on YouTube. We quickly pivoted this fall with the outbreak of war following the Hamas attacks on Israel of October 7th. And we've been diving into relevant sections of the Babylonian Talmud and related passages that explore the war and the conflict between Israel and Hamas from different angles in the traditional literature. And I've kept up with that. And I'm convinced that the Talmud is replete with relevant passages for us to contemplate while our attention is otherwise directed to Israel. Today, recognizing that the last several weeks of our study have been pretty darn heavy, today I hope will be a little bit more, if not light, then perhaps a little bit of a spiritual uplift, since we're not going to be talking so much about deep ethical dilemmas, and we're going to explore passages that I think are more about the Jewish psyche, about Jewish spirituality, and about the experience of the Jew in exile in relationship to Eretz Yisrael. So today is really about the spirituality of the land of Israel and why Israel matters, or at the minimum, we should be able to derive some insights into why Israel mattered and how Israel mattered to the sages of the Babylonian Talmud, who in vast preponderance were living, working, writing outside Eretz Yisrael. Just so that you understand my terminology, I will be referring to the place that we call Israel as Eretz Yisrael, which is simply the Hebrew term that means the land of Israel. So it refers to geography, right? It refers to a place, not necessarily to a political entity. So I try to be very specific in my terminology, especially on matters that are both confusing and often confused and can be misappropriated by the ignorant. So the biblical term for the territory in question is Eretz Yisrael, the land of Israel. And the borders actually do change throughout the record of the Jewish people's historical experience, even in the Tanakh itself. When we talk about Eretz Yisrael, at various times in ancient Israelite history, the territory that is described by that, if just talking about physical boundaries, grows and contracts. Parts of it are conquered. Parts of it are expanded through military conquest. I'm not referring to any one specific period, but rather the way in which Jewish people historically related to this part of the world is through the term Eretz Yisrael. It is the same territory, again, roughly, with what formerly was known as Canaan or Canaan. And once it is inhabited by the Israelite people or the Hebrews or later the Jews, it is known as Israel, but I'm going to use Eretz Yisrael. As we have, I'm sure, covered in this class, it was renamed Palestine or Palestina by the Roman Empire following the failed Bar Kokhba revolt. So we're talking about the first half of the 2nd century of the Common Era, when Bar Kokhba's rebellion was put down by Roman force in and around 135 CE of the Common Era. This really marks the beginning of widespread Jewish diaspora or dispersion outside of Eretz Yisrael, where the main seats of Jewish civilization will variously develop in communities, really for the first time in history, outside, or the first time in post-biblical history, outside Eretz Yisrael. So you will have the principal Jewish communities growing in Babylonia. And there, of course, had been Jewish settlement in Babylonia since at least the 6th century BCE, at the time of the conquest by Babylonia of the Judean kingdom, which is the southern kingdom of the Israelite people. Judah, Yehudah, which gives its name, by the way, to the Jews. The people from Judah are the Yehudim. In exile, the exiled Yehudim, I'm going back to the 6th century BCE, develop a more cohesive identity as Jews, and a number of important developments for the Jewish community, even including the standard Jewish calendar, is developed in Babylonian exile 6 centuries before the Common Era. So variously, our people call themselves Yehudim or Jews or Israelites or Hebrews. The territory of our historic experience in biblical times was Eretz Yisrael, formerly Canaan. And even when known to the wider world as Palestine, Jews continued to relate to this territory as Eretz Yisrael. And there, by the way, did remain a Jewish community, if not a majority community for the territory, nevertheless a Jewish community of some population significance in Eretz Yisrael, even when the majority of the Jewish civilization was growing outside of Eretz Yisrael. In Babylonia, as we've just said, in the Greco-Roman world, so throughout the Mediterranean rim, both north of the Mediterranean and south of the Mediterranean, there are extant and consistent Jewish communities in places that are familiar to us, like Alexandria and North Africa and Tunisia, and of course, a Jewish community that establishes its roots at a fairly early point in Jewish history, all diasporan, in other words, meaning all after the 2 failed Jewish rebellions against Rome, first in 70 and then again in the 130s under Bar Kokhba. You have Jews putting down roots in and around Rome. And the Roman Jewish community, by the way, to this day still brags that it, or boasts that it is the oldest extant, consistent Jewish community from antiquity to today. They have their own prayer book. They have their own ritual norms that you can observe if you ever worship on, for instance, Shabbat at the main synagogue in Rome. And you have Jews establishing themselves in places like Greece, and these are really old Jewish communities. But the principal seat of Jewish civilization post-diaspora or in diaspora is in Babylonia, and that, of course, is where the greatest work of Jewish literature of all time, outside of the Torah itself, the Babylonian Talmud, is produced. So that's a little bit on just what we're talking about and how I'm using some terminologies for our study. Mom and Dad, you want to chime in here?
Was there a Jewish population in Egypt?
Yes, I mean, Alexandria is Egypt, and Cairo. And despite the fact that the Torah itself warns about the population that was liberated from Pharaoh ever going back to Egypt, we know that in fact Jews went back to Egypt at the same time as the Babylonian conquest. So Jeremiah, I believe, himself goes to Egypt at the time the Babylonians overthrow the Judean monarchy in 586 under King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylonia. Many remain in a decapitated state, probably the hoi polloi, the masses, the impoverished. The aristocracy of the Jewish community and perhaps the religious elite, the priests and scribes, go into Babylonian captivity. I'm sure that masses of Jews went to Babylonia in chains, and many, I'm sure, were slaughtered at the time of the Babylonian conquest of 586 BCE. But some go to Egypt and remain there. And there's, lots of historical evidence and textual evidence for Jewish civilization continuing in Egypt throughout Jewish history. A small Jewish community remains in Cairo, and Alexandria. Most of the Jews who in the 20th century were part of the Cairene Jewish community. Cairo had many tens of thousands of Jews, I think 80,000 at some point, before the establishment of the State of Israel in 1948, again, using the language of State of Israel to differentiate between Medinat Yisrael, which is the State of Israel, the political entity that is a direct result of Zionist enterprise beginning in the 1800s. At that time, when Israel was established, many countries that had significant Jewish populations throughout North Africa and the Middle East expelled their Jews as a kind of collateral damage for the establishment of the State of Israel and the shared sense that the Arab world viewed the creation of the State of Israel as a thumb in its eye, and so expelled its Jews by force and by policy. And some 800,000 Jews were expelled from Arab countries at that time, including Egypt. About a tenth of the Jewish diaspora from Arab lands in the 20th century after the establishment of the State of Israel came from Egypt. Most of those Jews trace their roots back to the Spanish expulsion and not all the way back to biblical time, right? So the Egyptian Jewish community, to my best understanding, are a blend of Sephardic, meaning coming from the Iberian Peninsula. Sepharad is the Spanish word for Spain. So they're refugees from 1492 and following, where Jews left Spain, but many of them settled throughout North Africa, including the most famous representative of the Sephardic Jewish community, who left centuries before the expulsion, and that's Maimonides. Right, Maimonides was from Spain, was prominent in the southern Spanish Jewish communities like Cordoba, migrated through North Africa, eventually settling in Fez and then Cairo. And so you have examples of like the Cairo Geniza, which dates back to, more than 1,000 years ago, which is a repository of Jewish books and artifacts or articles, essays, paper, parchment in the basement of what was a synagogue, giving testimony to a long-standing Jewish community even before the Spanish expulsion. So that's how I would frame that. Okay, so that's just Eretz Yisrael in the Jewish historical experience. What we're going to look at today is Eretz Yisrael in the Jewish psyche, as expressed through traditional passages from the rabbinic literature. Before we dive into the passages of Talmud that I'd like to study.
No.
Sorry, I muted myself when I meant to mute someone else. Hello. So what I'd like to do now is proceed to a passage from our liturgy. So you may not know this about Sepharia, whose virtues I can't help but extol at every possible opportunity. But Sepharia, in addition to having classical texts like Torah and Talmud and Mishnah and Midrash online, it also has all sorts of traditional prayer books. So I've called up the menu from Sepharia called Sidur Ashkenaz under the liturgy section of Sepharia. So Sidur, the prayer book, Ashkenaz, of the Ashkenazi Rite, R-I-T-E, meaning this is the prayer custom as written down by the Ashkenazi Jewish community and used to this day. And you can see that in the contents, you can choose weekday services, morning, afternoon, or evening, Shacharit, Mincha, Mariv, or Shabbat liturgy, festival liturgy, special blessings, special Kaddishes. So it's so comprehensive. So let's say we want to find the morning service for the Ashkenazi Rite on a weekday. This is important. So most of us are used to davening on Shabbat and festivals, but of course, 3 times a day, pious Jews pray on weekdays. So let's look at the Shacharit or morning service for a weekday, and you have this very easy to use menu, some of which may have names that are familiar and some which are unfamiliar. Preparatory prayers, a section called Psuke de Zimra, which means verses of song or praise, blessings of the Shema, the Amidah, blessings that come after the Amidah, the Torah reading, concluding prayers, and anything that happens after the concluding prayers. So we're going to highlight the Amidah, the very central portion, which are the Amidah means to stand. So these are the prayers for which you stand, sometimes called the Tefillah, or the Shmona Esrei, the 18 benedictions. And you can see they go in order. They wouldn't call it Avot v'Imachot, but the Avot prayer, Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu ve'Elohei avotenu v'imotenu, right? You know this. The Givurot prayer, Atah Gibor le'olam Adonai, the holiness of God and Kedusha prayers, and so on and so forth. But I want to highlight a few of these because 3 times a day for 2,000 years, Jews have been praying in more or less the same way. Obviously, the Ashkenazi rite is not 2,000 years old, but the basic rubrics and building blocks of Jewish prayer and specific language of Jewish prayer is, for all intents and purposes, a 2,000-year-old record of how the rabbinic community or the Jewish community under rabbinic direction prays 3 times a day. And these words are still the words that are used in any Orthodox synagogue, at least in the Ashkenazi world. So you've got these 18 benedictions, and if you scroll down just a little bit, after blessings for repentance, forgiveness, redemption, healing, and prosperity, we have a few that are directly related to our subject of inquiry. So I'm going to just click here on gathering the exiles. So as you can see, really nice headline, weekday Shacharit prayers, the Amidah, gathering the exiles. All right, so just translating a little bit. Tika, like tekiah, by the way, tika b'shofar gadol, blast out on a big shofar, l'cherutenu, for our freedom or liberty. V'san nes, and lift up a banner, but a nes, many of us also recognize this word from the upcoming Hanukkah practices. Nes is a miracle, like the nun on your dreidel, nes gadol hayasham. So lift up either a banner or a miracle. Likabetz galuyotenu. Kabetz, you may recognize, same root as the word kibbutz, which means to collect or gather, right? A kibbutz is a collective. So likabetz is the verb form of making a kibbutz, which is make a collective or collect. Gather in. Galuyotenu. Galut in the Hebrew means exile. So gather in our exiles. So raise a banner to gather our exiles, or perhaps lift up a miracle for the gathering of our exiles. Vikabetzenu, which is the same root, gather in or gather up, collect. Yachad, together. May arba kanfot haaretz. Arba is the number 4. Kanfot are corners, haaretz, of the land, of the world. So gather up our exiles from the 4 corners of the earth. Baruch atah Adonai, all blessings end with what is called a chatima, or figuratively, it's an affirmation. Literally, it means to seal something, S-E-A-L. So like to put a stamp on a prayer, you always invoke the formula, blessed are you, Adonai, because all Jewish prayers are built on the building block of bracha, of blessing God. Blessed are you, Adonai, mikabetz, there's that root again, who gathers up or gathers in, nidche amo Yisrael, the dispersed, nidche, in this case from a word meaning to be spread out or dispersed, amo Yisrael, of God's people Israel. All right, so 3 times a day in traditional Jewish practice, and the same prayer, by the way, I believe in identical form, exists in the Sidurim of the Sephardic people, Sephardic communities, and of the Roman Jewish communities, and the Greek, and the etc. There are lots of different prayer rites, R-I-T-E-S. Ashkenazi, of course, is the one most of us Jews of Eastern European or European extraction are familiar with. So every day Jews pray, gather up our exiles who have been dispersed all over the world. Okay. Scrolling down a bit more, I'm going to skip just a couple of blessings ahead. There's a blessing against our enemies, which is interesting. There's a blessing for our righteous. Then a few blessings down, we get to another prayer, that is again recited 3 times a day in the course of the Shemona Esrei, or the 18 benedictions of the Amidah. V'lirushalayim, so, and unto Jerusalem, ircha, your city, berachamim, in mercy, rachmanis, rachamim, tashuv, return, like teshuva, returning, right? So, v'lirushalayim ircha, berachamim tashuv, unto Jerusalem, your city, in mercy, return. Which means God should return to Jerusalem, which is really interesting, because the assumption here, the implication, what is implied in the text is, wait a minute, if we're praying that God will return to Jerusalem, it means not only have the people, it doesn't say tashiv, which would be the transitive form of the same verb, right? A transitive verb acts on an object, an intransitive verb does not act on an object, right? So God return means God should return, God's self. God return the exiles means God should act on the Jewish people so that we return or they return. Following the difference between transitive and intransitive. So the verb form here is transitive, where actually the subject is doing the action unto the subject's self. God, you return to Jerusalem. Again, the implication is a startling theological claim that God is outside Jerusalem as well. That when in exile, the divine is in exile with the Jewish people. And that's a really important claim that is consistently made throughout rabbinic literature, that when the Jews went into exile, whether, by the way, it was the first time or times around as a biblical community in the exile of Egyptian slavery under Pharaoh, let my people go, etc., or later in the rabbinic period in the exile of post-Bar Kokhba, or post-Bar Kokhba, the most of the centuries of the Common Era, God is in exile with us. Where was God? God was in exile with us. Okay, v'tishkon bitocha, and dwell therein, dwell in the midst, right? Ka'asher dibarta, as you promised you would. This is God's promise. The prophetic literature, the Torah itself is replete with promises that the Jewish people and God will be situated forever and ever according to an eternal covenant in the land of Israel. And yet the experience for, most, if not all of Jewish history has been not that. We're not living in the land that God promised. And so God's promise has to be remembered to God at regular intervals, like 3 times a day. Hey, God, remember you're supposed to bring us back? Okay. Uvene otach, and build it up. B'nei, this is a little bit of a false cognate. This isn't b'nei as in b'nei Yisrael, which means the children of Israel or the Israelites. In this case, it's a verb, b'nei, which means to build, from the Hebrew verb boneh. Bet nun he is boneh. To build up otah, meaning the city of Jerusalem, bikarov biyamenu, a phrase that you probably have heard once or twice, speedily in our day. Build it up now. Binyan olam, from the same root boneh, as a everlasting structure. A binyan is a building. Like in modern Hebrew, just any building is a binyan. Something that is built comes from the Hebrew verb to build. Olam means eternal. The chisei David, the throne of David, or the chair of David. Some of you remember your traumatized years in Hebrew school may have been told to sit in a chisei. A chisei is a chair. It also means a throne. Chisei David, the throne of David, mehera, speedily, letocha tachin, establish it in the midst of that place, meaning Jerusalem. Baruch ata Adonai, here's the chatima, or the seal to the prayer, the affirmation at the end. What are we really asking God for? In one summary line, Bonei Yerushalayim, the one who builds up Jerusalem. So again, the centrality of Israel is affirmed numerous times, 3 times a day, in our daily prayers, right? It's encoded into the spoken and lived experience of the Jewish people. Among the vast majority of Jewish people who are praying these words over the vast majority of Jewish history never set foot in the soil of Eretz Yisrael. Right? That's what I want you to understand. And so these days in particular, when the legitimacy of the Jewish establishment of a state in Eretz Yisrael, which is, of course, known to us as Zionism. That is the subject of the short form course, that mini course that I'm teaching on Sunday afternoon, midday Sundays, including this coming Sunday. We had one session last Sunday. I'm linking that enterprise, which is really a history class, to our enterprise, which is not a history class. Talmud is not history, it is our story, right? So this is the our story class. And what I'm teaching on Sundays is the history class. But in some ways, you can't really disentangle one from the other. You need to understand how deeply embedded this place is in the Jewish psyche and the Jewish experience, and not only in Jewish history. Because if you're only looking at history, you could say, well, yeah, we might have been indigenous at some point, at some level, but there were people in Eretz Yisrael before we were, we meaning the Jewish people or the descendants of the biblical Israelites. There were people there before us. The Torah expressly states this many, many times, that it was not a depopulated land when the Israelite released slaves from Pharaoh's bondage, went there and conquered it. Joshua, they had to fight Canaanites and other nations or tribes in order to possess the land of promise. But one could argue, hey, if you only look at Jewish history, 2,000 years of not living in a place might delegitimate one's claim to that place. And yet, that is why we Jews relate to Israel not only through the lens of history and fact, in the way we usually use the word fact, but rather spiritual truth as well, right? The Jewish connection to Israel was not, in fact, severed by exile. If anything, the Jewish psychic connection, the Jewish spiritual connection to Israel only grew stronger in exile. It's really a fascinating thing. So even as we became loyal and law-abiding citizens of innumerable other communities outside of Eretz Yisrael, in galut, or in exile, in diaspora, we never stopped considering Israel our home. And just the follow-up prayer here, which is about the reestablishment of the Davidic dynasty. And then we get into the final prayers here. In the traditional understanding, we even pray for a restoration of the rebuilding of the temple and the temple service. And there's some notes here. And may our eyes behold your merciful return to Zion, the poetic name for Eretz Yisrael. Blessed are you, Adonai, who returns the Shekhinah, or the divine presence, that word here, to Zion. And then we conclude the Amidah. So fully three or four of the prayers of the Amidah express the Jewish spiritual connection to Eretz Yisrael in one way or another. Okay, I see a Doug and Marge hand. So Mom and Dad, chime in.
The first passage that we read, although it doesn't mention the tabernacle, that seems to be the clear thrust of the prayer. I mean, rebuild as an everlasting monument. So
yeah, I mean,
the rebuilding of the the necessity to rebuild the tabernacle.
Yeah, let me just kind of like zhuzh your language just a little bit and differentiate between tabernacle and temple. I think we should use temple.
You're right. I meant temple.
Right, because tabernacle is the temporary structure that the Torah describes was used and built by the Israelite community at God's and Moses's own, hand-delivered direction down to every last tent pole and goat hair and dye that you're supposed to use. Whereas temple refers to the permanent structure in.
I did mean temple. I did mean temple.
Yeah, no, it does. Like the prayer, whether you know it or not, and whatever your theology personally may be, when you participate in the collective prayers of the weekday service, very prominently included among them are prayers for the rebuilding and the restoration of the Davidic temple. Now, again, that is a concept which says a lot about the Jewish psyche. I will be the first to claim that it is not, for me, politically desirable. Like, I actually think it would be highly dangerous to empower those Jews who even today, and they may be fringe, but they're dangerous fringe, The fact that they're fringe doesn't mean they're not dangerous, who actually want to enact a political reality to realize these prayers, right? They actually want to change the game. So, some of this is related to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in the sense that among the legitimate grievances of the Palestinian people, I believe, is needless provocation by right-wing Israeli government officials and religious zealots, Jewish religious zealots, who just can't stop themselves from antagonizing Palestinian worshipers, Muslim worshipers, on what we think of as the Temple Mount and what they call, Haram al-Sharif, the noble dome, referring to Al-Aqsa. That this is a Muslim holy place. It is under the jurisdiction of the Waqf, which is an Islamic organization dedicated to the preservation and use of Islamic holy sites. And that, the fact of the matter is, yes, down beneath it is the Kotel, the Western Wall, the most sacred site in Judaism, the only extant remains of our temple compound. Those who want to disrupt the status quo, and status quo is actually the political term that is used by both the Waqf and by the government of Israel. Those who want to disrupt the status quo, even without the use of violence, I think are playing a very dangerous game. So it's one thing to say something in your prayers. It's quite another to take matters into your own hand and enact a political reality. And by the way, I'm going to come back to this language because it is the perfect segue to the Talmud passage we're going to look at today, is kind of exploring the difference between what our texts tell us about the Jewish connection to Eretz Yisrael and what Zionism actually did, which was establish a political reality on the ground that had only been the subject of prayer and literature for the better part of 2,000 years prior to the Zionist movement, or movements. Aaron Resko, you're next.
Going back to when you talked about how being in exile didn't negate the Jews feeling that Eretz Yisrael was home, I almost wonder if they have to go together. If, the fact that you're forcibly removed from what you consider home or not allowed to be there is a necessary part of feeling for the diaspora to feel like this is home, which I personally didn't really understand until about 5 weeks ago.
Right. A comment that, by the way, I think speaks for itself, and I think you're very much not alone in that. That why Israel matters is a case that Jewish leaders and rabbis like myself have been trying to make for many, many years. And I've found up until October 7th, 2023, that the single most effective way to get people to understand this is by taking trips to Israel. The second most effective way is to have Israeli family or friends, or to make Israeli family or friends. For instance, go to summer camp where you develop a close relationship with an Israeli who's there to help the kids understand Israel better. But everything else, it's almost an academic exercise, and it's very hard to establish a sense of emotional, psychic belonging to a place where many Jewish people living in diaspora, historically and even today, have never set foot. And, I think that October 7th did change that for many American Jews, that even Jews who've never set foot in Israel or who have only a tenuous connection with Israel have a very different understanding of Israel's importance in Jewish life and in Jewish destiny. And, one of the things that is, I think, the thing that is most terrifying about Hamas's attack and Hamas's stated aims vis-a-vis the Jewish state is that for the first time in my lifetime, or at least the first time since I was 16 days old when the Yom Kippur War broke out, American Jews or Jews outside of Israel feel what Israelis feel, which is that they are in an existential fight right now. That this is not just swatting away mosquito-like rockets, that this is about defeating an enemy that is hell-bent on a jihadist conquest of the Jewish state. And has very powerful allies, some of whom may or may not have nuclear weapons, to back up that intention.
It's also the realization as a born and bred American that this isn't really my home as soon as people realize who I am.
Right. So that has gone in tandem with many American Jews feeling, you know, on the mildest end, a kind of weak and pathetic response from the people we had looked to as our allies, at least in many parts of Jewish America. Certainly in the progressive end of the political spectrum, a lot of people we had just assumed would be natural bedfellows, whether that's the communities of, you know, LGBTQ Americans or Black Americans involved in Black Lives Matter. They are not standing by the side of American Jews who believe that Israel is existentially threatened right now. And in fact, some have been quick to stand by the side of Hamas, which is just, in my view, morally catastrophic. So let's take a few other comments and thoughts. So a lot of, and by the way, that's not even to the extent that people, and Aaron, I know you can relate to this, are now experiencing not just covert, but overt anti-Semitism here, right? It's not just that Hamas is attacking Israelis in broad daylight and butchering them. It is also that anti-Semitic hostility has increased at least fourfold in America since October 7th, as tracked by the ADL. So very well taken observations on your part. Thank you. Alan Markowitz, please.
The conversation reminds me of a parable that I heard a long, long time ago, where there was this fellow, not a middle-aged man, was not a chassid, but he was very observant, lived in Vilna, and he says, I've been praying to go to make an Aliyah. It's like the 1920s, between the wars. Been dreaming about making Aliyah to be to Israel. Been praying 3 times a day. So he finally packs up and moves out away, goes to Israel, and 6 months later, he appears back on the streets of Vilna. And his friends say, Yankel, you made Aliyah. You went to Israel. What happened? Why did you come back? He said, I went to Israel. There are no Jews there.
Oh, it's so funny and so true. Right?
It is.
Yep. And you know, look, Judaism is not a religion that, first of all, Judaism is not a religion, full stop. But Judaism as a spiritual practice does not flourish in isolation. It is not primarily a hermetic, monastic, individually pietistic tradition. To the extent that Judaism is a religious enterprise, the Jewish religion is primarily expressed in community. And so, right, so that's sort of like the inside of that joke about the man from Vilna. Like, it is, you can't really be fully a Jew in isolation. And I've had some experiences that bear out this claim or this conclusion that I've reached. My first rabbinic pulpit was as a student rabbi in Williamson, West Virginia, population about 2,000, on the border of Eastern Kentucky, so deep, deep Appalachia. And the membership of the congregation was 8 families, making it at the time the smallest synagogue in the Union for Reform Judaism, or what was then called the UAHC, the Union of American Hebrew Congregations, the Reformed synagogue arm that Rabbi Rick Jacobs now helms. And I'll tell you that, like, you know, they only had a rabbi come 2 days of the year, Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. And there was a deep sense of loss and longing by the elders of the community. And of course, everyone in the community was elderly, because all of their children, and in some cases grandchildren, had moved away. Because, I mean, it was sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy, but it's very hard to be a Jew in exile alone. It's very hard to be a Jew. It's very hard to be a Jew in exile, but I would say it is nigh on impossible to be a Jew in exile alone. Right? So we need community. And by the way, statehood was not viable for the Zionists until there was a certain amount of Jews living in Eretz Yisrael, which is why a huge part of the political enterprise of Zionism, in other words, that aspect of Zionism, which was not about just revitalizing Judaism as a spiritual tradition, but was about boots on the ground, like getting Jews to the land of Israel. So much of Zionism is a story of immigration and how to create pathways to immigration, at times against restrictive immigration policies that were implemented primarily under the Brits. So we'll talk about that this Sunday. That's going to be a piece of what we discuss. Let's do Kathy, who wrote a great question in the chat box as well. And maybe this is what she wants to ask, but I'll say it. What is the thinking on the following topic? When the Jews established the state of Israel, did God precede them or follow the Jews back? It's a debate. And the text we're finally going to get to on the Talmud actually will help us uncover that question. In addition, Kathy, did you want to ask more or say more with your hand raised?
Yeah, can you hear me?
We hear you great.
Great, terrific. I always get that wrong. So this is
no, you got it right.
This is a question from a beginner's mind, I'll preface, because sometimes I feel like I'm way off. But I mean, it's quite lovely that there is an idea that God left Israel with the diaspora to be with the Jews. However, not every Jew left, and I'd like to believe that God is there with every Jew and really with every person who seeks him out. But what, and you talked about the fact that, what claim to Israel would we have? And there are those who say that the Jews would not exist right now without Israel. How lovely it would be if God preceded the Jews to Israel, back to Israel in full force and said, come back, you need to be here to survive.
First of all, I don't think you're off at all. And I don't think that your inquiry is in any way a beginner's inquiry. I think that you're touching on something very deep about the experience of being Jewish in the world and in history, which is, let me put it this way. To be a Jew comfortably in the world requires that you have a high threshold for discomfort. And in particular, you have a high threshold for intellectual discomfort and a high capacity for embracing paradox. Now, Kathy, you and I have had conversations about this going back 15 years and more, that on the one hand, Judaism is a particularistic phenomenon with a particularistic theology, right? A God that specifically chooses and protects one people among all peoples. And yet, the overarching spiritual outlook of Judaism as a civilization unto itself for 3,000 or more years has also been universalistic. That the mission of the particular Jewish people with our particular relationship with Yahweh, the deity assigned, as it were, to the Jewish people, or who evolves in relationship with the Jewish people more accurately, is a tradition about the redemption of all humankind and the entire universe, right? And these two things do not only contradict, they also coexist. And so your question here is like, the answer is yes. Did God go with us in exile? Yes. Did God remain in some way connected to the people and the land of Eretz Yisrael? Also yes. And the different Jews and different Jewish civilizations within the master civilization have had different relationships with how much Israel matters and how much God's divine election of the Jewish people is directly linked to our geographic centrality in or to Eretz Yisrael. And that's what we're going to get to in the Talmud, I promise. So I'm going to take one more comment, then we're going to move forward. There's a great question, Kathy. Arlene, just unmute yourself before you speak, please.
So one of my concerns, Jonathan, is that the upcoming generation of Jews are very bright students who are in colleges and some of our finest schools that we can offer in terms of education have engaged in the most anti-Semitic behavior. And it seems to me that there is no way that this is changing. And I don't know what's happening rabbinically in terms of trying to reach out to some of these young students so that they can not feel that the only way, the only direction that they can take is to be pro-Palestinian.
I'm going to, comment with, I hope, a more optimistic appraisal from what I am seeing. Now, note well, I am the senior rabbi of a congregation that has, in my view, a little brag here, done a very good job of developing Jewish youth who feel that they are positively identified with Judaism and who are positively identified with Israel, and who are also positively identified with Judaism's traditions of social justice and liberation for all oppressed peoples.
And you're absolutely correct, because my kids, when they went off to college, always became active in Hillel and always had a very strong Jewish identity.
Right. And I would say the vast majority of students who grow up in synagogues like ours, I'm not worried about them on their college campuses. And by the way, the vast majority of Jewish students on college campuses right now, the fact that they're feeling scared and harassed means that they identify with the experience of being Jewish in a way that is going to be galvanizing for them. A small but vocal minority, but I'm talking fringe, a small but vocal minority of Jewish students are aligned with Palestinian liberation in a way that I think is dangerous and must be confronted. But it's a small percentage. And I think that, some of this is about just, not allowing them to dominate the conversation about Israel. And that's a long fight. And by the way, it doesn't run only through education of youth. It has a lot to do with, among other things, Qatari money funding professorships on major universities across America, right? So there are huge issues above students and even above faculty that have to do with administration and money and power and boards of colleges. And we're seeing really important galvanizing shifts in how the American Jewish community is relating to the problem in higher academia in this country. And the kind of noxious lies about Israel and the Jewish state and anti-Semitic hostility toward Jewish students that is now exposed for what it is as anti-Semitism, and I think will be vigorously confronted. Because no college president or board wants its institutions to lose billions of dollars in Jewish philanthropy. I mean, that's part of it. That's part of it.
Of course.
But the war of words on the campuses and flags and demonstrations and that is not actually where the debate resides, in my view. Okay, I'm gonna move forward. Kathy, I'm gonna pause on your question. I'm not gonna take it right now, but I will come back because I really want to make sure we study some Gemara today. So for a half hour, we're gonna look at some passages from the Babylonian Talmud, specifically from the end of tractate Ketubot, which is a tractate about marriage contracts, the Ketubah. And just so you get the link, right? Because we've talked about this many, many times, but this is a great example of how you think you're studying one thing when you open up the Talmud, and then all of a sudden you're studying something else because it's like just following a free-flowing conversation. This is the link between how do we get from ketubas or marriage contracts to Eretz Yisrael and its spiritual significance to the Jewish people and the Jewish psyche? Read and learn. Okay. The sages taught if a husband says that he wants to ascend, meaning he wants to make Aliyah, ascend, right, to go up. In the Jewish spiritual tradition, making Aliyah, emigrating to Israel, is always an ascent. It's always going up. And by the way, the verb that means its opposite, to emigrate from Israel, is to make Yeridah. It's a word you may be less familiar with. You may have heard of Aliyah, but never heard of Yeridah. Yeridah just means go down. And by the way, with at least respect to Jerusalem, it's almost always geographically, or I should say topographically true as well, right? To go to Jerusalem, you always ascend. Like if you're just on a bus that lands at the Ben Gurion airport, kind of a little bit east of Tel Aviv, you go up to Jerusalem. Okay, if a husband says he wants to make Aliyah, And his wife says that she does not want to make Aliyah. So husband and wife, they're married, they're in a bit of a debate. He says, you know what? We have to make Aliyah to Israel. Now remember, this is written by and for people who in all likelihood never would have set foot in Eretz Yisrael. This is the Babylonian Talmud. There is a Talmud that comes from what was then Palestine. It is sometimes called the Palestinian Talmud. It was written in the area of the Galilee, the northern part of Israel. It is not actually from Jerusalem, because Jews were exiled from Jerusalem explicitly by the Romans after Bar Kokhba fell. However, in Jewish communities, it is typically called the Yerushalmi, or the Jerusalem Talmud. That is not the Talmud we study. It is by far the less prominent of the two Talmuds of the Jewish people. So the Babylonian Talmud is an exilic document, but it's hypothetically contemplating the following situation. Husband wants to make Aliyah, wife does not. And if she will not do so, as she resists all attempts to force her to make the move, she is divorced without receiving her ketubah. In other words, she forfeits her rights to the benefits outlined in the marriage contract. A ketubah is just a prenup, and it stipulates that in the event of divorce, particularly with cause on the part of the wife, the husband is obligated to pay out certain stipulated sums that are outlined in the contract. In this case, they're saying, okay, the divorce can be effectuated. The ketubah is therefore fulfilled without the payment. All right, this is really, we're going to put aside your distaste for the built-in misogyny, if you can. I have to, and that requires a little bit of strenuous effort on my part. Put aside your 21st century appropriately anti-misogynist perspective, which I assume we all share, and try and get at what's being recorded spiritually about what Eretz Yisrael means to the Jewish people. If she says that she wishes to make Aliyah, and he says that he does not wish to make Aliyah, one forces the husband to assent. So if the wife wants to go, even if the husband says, no, honey, I've got a good job here in Babylonia, life is good, the kids are growing up, they have a nice Jewish community, the schools are good here, do we really want to go to this, swamp-infested malarial backwater, right? And the wife insists, the husband has to go, he is compelled, and usually when it says one forces him, it means under penalty by a Beit Din, or a rabbinical court, compels him to go. And if he does not wish to immigrate, he must divorce her and give her the ketubah, including its payment. Okay, thoughts just on this, Kathy? Oh, unmute first, please.
My understanding is that a wife cannot ask for divorce and get it unless the man agrees to it. So she has no rights to divorce on her own. So this actually gives her a little more rights than she would get on her own.
Right. So I'm delighted to disabuse you of your popular misconception. A woman, in fact, has several rights that are outlined in the ketubah that provide legitimate grounds for divorce. The ketubah, even to this day, a traditional ketubah, and some of you may have one of these stored away in your home or even framed. If you had an Orthodox wedding or a non-Orthodox wedding, but with an Orthodox ketubah, looking at you, Alan Markowitz, though not sure. It stipulates that a husband is obligated to furnish for his wife food, shelter, and marital satisfaction, which is a euphemism, either for sexual satisfaction or for procreation. And if the husband defaults on any of these three core obligations, the woman actually has grounds for divorce. So what's interesting here is, although it is not explicitly written in the ketubah, the rabbis of at least this passage in the Babylonian Talmud propose a fourth condition, that if the woman wants to make Aliyah and her husband doesn't and adamantly refuses not to make Aliyah, that too is legitimate grounds for divorce, and the husband will be obligated to pay out the sum as recorded in the ketubah. All right, so again, this was supposed to be just a kind of like teaser or preamble to how do we get from ketubahs to the spiritual significance of Eretz Yisrael. And what we're looking at is, this is the passage that links those two seemingly unrelated subjects and allows the Talmud in its conversational, free-flowing, non-directional style to take us into a very different kind of line of inquiry. Okay, so this goes on and on and on, and I'm not going to delve into that. What I'm going to do is skip to the bottom of Ketubot 110b to get into the preamble to 111a, which is where all the really interesting stuff resides. So the Gemara relates the following passage. Rabbi Zera was avoiding being seen by his teacher, Rabbi Yehuda. And again, this is Steinsaltz in the plain print. The bold print is what the Talmud actually says. So you have to kind of interpolate, and thank God the great Adin Steinsaltz of blessed memory gives us these glosses. Rabbi Zera was avoiding his teacher. He didn't want his teacher to see him because they had the following disagreement. Rabbi Zera wanted to go make Aliyah. He sought to ascend to Eretz Yisrael, but he wanted to make Aliyah, but implied his teacher, Rabbi Yehuda, disapproved. And how do we know he disapproved? Because Rabbi Yehuda is on record with the following statement: anyone who ascends from Babylonia to Eretz Yisrael transgresses a positive mitzvah, as it is stated, jarring our memories here. Two basic kinds of mitzvot: positive, which are called mitzvah aseh, and it says, you can even see it's abbreviated here to an aseh. He over ba'aseh. Literally, he transgresses a positive bracket mitzvah. He transgresses a positive mitzvah, an aseh, something you must do. Giving tzedakah is a positive mitzvah. Lighting Shabbos candles is a positive mitzvah, right? Any number of things where the thou shalts of Jewish tradition are positive mitzvot, and the thou shalt nots are the negative mitzvot. And they have a different force in Jewish tradition, especially along gender lines. For instance, all Jews, men and women, are obligated to the negative mitzvot. It is not okay for anyone to commit murder in the Jewish tradition. Thou shalt not commit murder. That's a negative mitzvah. It is not incumbent on everyone to study Torah. That is only incumbent on Jewish men in the classical understanding of the mitzvot. So women are actually exempted from most of the positive mitzvot, save for three. They have to light the Shabbos candles. They have to donate or sacrifice the challah, the dough offering. So women are on Fridays, and they are the ones who have to confirm the establishment of an eruv prior to Shabbat. So women are responsible for three Shabbat-related commandments. They are the only three mitzvot aseh, or positive commandments, that are incumbent on women in the Jewish tradition. All the other positive commandments are incumbent on men, and men and women alike are obligated to all the negative commandments, right? A woman is not exempt from observing Shabbat because all of the mitzvot associated with Shabbat, save for the three I just said, lighting candles, taking challah, and setting up the eruv, all of them are negative commandments. Shabbat is a list of 39 things you're not allowed to do. Can't tear, can't sew, can't write, can't make fire, right? You know these things. That's Shabbat observance in the tradition. It's things you can't do. And therefore, women and men are equally obligated. It's not okay for a woman to say, oh, I lit a fire Saturday at 2 p.m. because I was cold or because my house was dark, and I'm exempt because I'm a woman. No, that's a negative commandment. Okay, Barbara.
Where does the concept of ascend, to go up to Israel, come from?
Biblical, though I'd have to look at exactly which prophets use that verb, but I think it's actually consistently used throughout the biblical literature that anytime the Israelites are moving from one place outside the land of Israel to Eretz Yisrael, or within Eretz Yisrael from one location to Jerusalem or toward Jerusalem, the Hebrew verb is always ayin lamed hey, Allah.
Oh, I always thought that it was more of a term that was used more now, more modern now.
It is not. No, it is as old as our tradition. The idea of Aliyah baked in. Okay. And it, by the way, used a lot in the Joseph story. Joseph is constantly migrating, or Joseph's family, right? Because part of the Joseph story takes place in Canaan. But every time somebody in the Joseph story moves from Canaan to Egypt, it's yerida, yored, they go down. And anytime the Israelites are referred to as either coming back or someday they're going to come back, it's always la'alot, it's always to go up. Kathy?
Sorry. When were the women first allowed in the temple?
In a temple or in the temple?
Any temple.
The prophets actually, I think when they describe the temple, or maybe this is in the book of Ezekiel, prophets, there is a women's courtyard in the temple compound itself. So women are not restricted from access to the biblical temple. However, they are not permitted access to the whole temple. On the other hand, that's true for any common Israelite. Only the high priest, for instance, can go into the innermost sanctum, the Kodesh HaKodashim, the Holy of Holies.
Right.
The women are actually not, however, like kept entirely away from it, but they do not have the same access as men. Okay.
So, but they're responsible to do their best to adhere to the 10 Commandments.
Absolutely, especially since the 10 Commandments are mostly negative commandments. They're mostly thou shalt nots.
Yeah, okay.
So let's, and just because women may not have the same level of mitzvot incumbency as men, you know, the mitzvot are not incumbent on women the same way they are on men, the positive mitzvot, that does not mean that it is a bad thing. Like, women can study Torah, they're just not obligated to. That's why I think there's a significant movement in modern Orthodoxy to empower women to be teachers of Torah, though that is a significant debate. Can you be a rabbi and a woman? Okay, moving on. So what's Rabbi Yehuda's problem with making Aliyah from Babylonia? Like, isn't this living the Jewish dream? Like, if we're praying for it 3 times a day, and we know that these exilic communities are praying for it 3 times a day, because that's where we started our class today, what's the problem with actually doing it? Well, Rabbi Judah is going to quote the following verse. He says, "They shall be taken to Babylonia, and there they shall remain until the day that I recall them, says the Lord." So what's the problem with Rabbi Zera wanting to make Aliyah on his own? The timeline is off. God did not make this invitation yet. All right, so looking again at the verse that is being quoted from the prophet, and remember, Jeremiah is around at the time of the Babylonian conquest, and so he understands what's at stake here. He says, you are going to remain in captivity, and you must remain there until the day that I recall them, says the Lord, which is interpreted to mean, as it says in the Steinsaltz gloss, based on that verse, Rabbi Yehuda held that since the Babylonian exile was imposed by divine decree, permission to leave Babylonia for Eretz Yisrael could be granted only by God. Now, the Gemara then asks, and how does Rabbi Zera interpret that verse? So this is the guy who wants to make Aliyah. And the Gemara answers that Rabbi Zera maintains that the verse is written about not people, but things, the temple service vessels. And it does not refer to the Jewish. In other words, so Rabbi Zera said, no. The day that God recalls them just means that God is going to reestablish the temple with all of its furnishings. It has nothing to do with the personal desire of a Jewish person to make Aliyah or emigrate back to Eretz Yisrael. And it does not refer to the Jewish people as the previous verse states. Thus, and he gets it straight from the biblical context, in other words, thus says the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, concerning the vessels that remain in the house of the Lord. Remember, when the Babylonians came in, they decapitated the leadership. They brought the aristocracy and the high priesthood into exile. They probably slaughtered and enslaved countless numbers of Jewish people. But Jeremiah issues a prophecy that says, the temple vessels, all the sacred implements of Jewish worship and practice, will remain in the temple until the people come back. And Rabbi Zera says, okay, so that doesn't say anything about me making Aliyah. And how does Rabbi Yehuda respond to this argument? So there's a back and forth. The verse is clearly referring to the temple vessels, not to the people. The Gemara answers that, aha, there's another verse. So he has a second verse to back up the idea that you can't just emigrate on your own timeline. You can't just make Aliyah without God actually reestablishing the state, the commonwealth of the Jewish people, sovereign in Eretz Yisrael. I adjure you, O daughters of Jerusalem, by the gazelles and by the hinds of the field, that you not awaken or stir up love until it please. A very funny, romantic, poetic verse from the Song of Songs, that great erotic or love poem of the Hebrew Bible. In other words, Rabbi Yehuda derived from here that no act of redemption, that is divine redemption of the Jewish people, should be performed until a time when it pleases God to bring about the redemption. In other words, you not awaken or stir up love until it please, meaning only when God is ready can the Jewish people go back to Eretz Yisrael. Now, this is a massively important debate in the 20th century, right? So I want to just share for you, don't take it from me, take it from Daniel Gordis, whose book, Israel, A Concise History of a Nation Reborn, is the primary source that I'm using to learn and teach for my class on Zionism and the history of the conflict on Sundays, including this coming Sunday, the 19th. So what I want to do is just share a little bit of an excerpt from Gordis's book, but it doesn't seem to be coming up on my share screen. So a second, I'll bet you that, I wonder if Zoom put in like a protection against using this on Kindle. Am I able to share my Kindle? No, here it is. Good. All right. So this is an excerpt from Gordis's book, Israel, A Concise History. All right. So I'll pick up here. Bialik and Achad Ha'am, two of the great intellectual architects of Zionism. Bialik, a poet, Achad Ha'am, an author, essayist, and a member of the literati of the pre-state Israel, or British mandatory Palestine, and the father of what is today called cultural Zionism, where he talks about a spiritual renewal of the Jewish people, but didn't necessarily support immigrating to Palestine. So it says they never lost their love for traditional Jewish texts and the world that those texts evoked. I'm right here, by the way. And each wove their influence into his writing. Some Zionists, though, felt that Zionism was not only about transforming Judaism, but about moving beyond it altogether. Perhaps the best-known exponent of this position was the Russian scholar Mikhail Yosef Berdichevsky, who famously opined that Zionism needed to be a complete revolt against Judaism. It was time for Jews to free themselves of the dogmas of Jewish tradition, history, and religion, and essentially to reinvent themselves. He said, we can be the last Jews or the first Hebrews. And I talked about this a little bit last Sunday, that so much of Zionism was about returning to Eretz Yisrael to establish a polity, right? A political reality, a state, Jewish sovereignty, power, a shield against the historic vulnerability of the Jewish people, which was cresting in Europe beginning in the latter part of the 19th century, and we all know where it leads. So many Zionists, however, were equally engaged by the enterprise of revitalizing Judaism. Their premise was not only that we were an endangered species, as it were, as Jews in Europe in a hostile environment, but also that Judaism had become this dilapidated, ossified, fossilized relic of a ghetto existence that no longer served the needs of a vital Jewish people in such a way that it was actually becoming an existential threat to us to continue to practice, I'll just call it ghetto Judaism. Here's where Gordis is really interesting for us. It is therefore not surprising that if many of the Zionists rejected traditional Judaism, much of the traditional Jewish world also rejected Zionism. Though there were religious Jews among the Zionists, for many others, religious commitments were an explicit reason not to join the movement. So we're talking about religiously motivated or Jewishly derived anti-Zionism. The reasons dated back millennia. A much discussed passage in the Bablylonian Talmud, guess what passage that is? It's Ketubot 111b, it's what we're studying today, refers to 3 oaths to which Israel and the nations of the world committed themselves. The nations of the world swore that they would not oppress the nation of Israel excessively. See how that went? While Israel swore not to enter the land of Israel by force and not to rebel against the nations of the world. So let's see where that is in our Talmud text now. So going back to Ketubot, sorry, 111a, not b. Okay, so So you're not, according to Rabbi Yehuda, to his pupil, Rabbi Zera, you can't make Aliyah because God has not yet reestablished a divine throne, or the Messiah hasn't come. It's not God's timeline. And you don't get to decide when it's okay to emigrate back to Israel, to Eretz Yisrael, to make Aliyah. And Rabbi Zera maintains, so this is the guy who wants to make Aliyah, that the oath mentioned in that verse means that the Jews should not ascend to Eretz Yisrael as a wall, meaning en masse. And somebody asked this before, I forget who, talked about, well, you know, you need a community, right? We had that conversation today. So we say, no, what's being restricted here in the Talmud is mass immigration. But an individual who wants to go, sei gesinnt. The Gemara asks, and what was Rav Yehuda's reply? Remember, he is the antagonist in this story. He thinks that Rabbi Zera is violating a religious precept of the Jewish tradition. The Gemara answers that this command is derived from another verse in which I adjure you is written. In other words, God says, no, you can't do that. And how does Rabbi Zera explain the repetition of this oath in these verses? So now back to the guy who wants to make Aliyah. The Gemara explains that verse is necessary for that which was taught by Rabbi Yossi, son of Rabbi Hanina, who said, so another rabbi entirely says, why are these three oaths, as quoted in these three verses in the Song of Songs, needed? One, so that Jews would not make mass Aliyah to Eretz Yisrael, but rather little by little. So as a wall, you can't just force the Jewish population en masse back into their promised land territory. Another oath, that the Holy One, blessed be God, adjured the Jews that they should not rebel against the rule of the nations of the world. So in other words, like a mass immigration movement, at least some rabbis going all the way back to the period of the Babylonian exile, the Babylonian Talmud, said, no, this violates God's decree because it would be rebellion against the places in which Jews had made their communities in exile. And the last oath is that the Holy One, blessed be he, also adjured the other nations of the world that they should not subjugate the Jews excessively. So there is this incredibly rich, fertile dissent between two rabbis who really represent two Jewish positions that become, I think, real matters. Not just philosophical, not just intellectual inquiry, not just hypothetical, but when Zionism proposes that the goal here, at least as Herzl articulated it, was the establishment of a Jewish state in our biblical homeland, many religious Jews took the side of Rabbi Yehuda and said, no. This violates three core Jewish concepts, at least. One is that we're not allowed to go until God says so. This is not God's timeline. Two, mass immigration is particularly problematic, even if individual immigration, Aliyah, is allowed. Three, we're not supposed to rebel against the nations in which we have made our homes and our communities. And Jews, by the way, adhere to another overarching Talmudic dictum, which I talked about last Friday night in my sermon, called Dina de Malchuta Dina. It's Aramaic, it means Dina, from the Hebrew word din. Dina just means the law. De Malchuta, from Malchut, from Melech, of the kingdom, the law of the land, the law of the realm. Dina is the law. So you can remember these three words, two of which are the same. Dina de Malchuta Dina. It's one of the most important Talmudic precepts. The law of the land is the law. And this was a hedge or a shield against the oft-leveled anti-Semitic charge that Jews have dual loyalties, that wherever they find themselves, they really are more loyal to Israel or to their biblical homeland or to their God or to their laws than to the law of the land. Similar allegations, by the way, are made against Muslims in other non-majority Muslim communities, countries like America, that Muslims want to bring Sharia law, which is, I say what you will, I think that Islam has a massive jihadist problem right now. But Sharia is just the Arabic word that means the same thing as halakha. It means the way. It's the laws that govern their religious community. Now, I think that Judaism goes much farther than Islam in providing that Jews must be law-abiding according to the law of the land, wherever that land may be. And Talmudic passages like this in the mouth of Rabbi Judah back that up, right? That to be a Jew means you must abide by the law of the land in which you live in exile. We are not taught to rebel against the kingdom. And mass immigration would certainly look like that. And the third is kind of this very interesting idea that, and by the way, God swore in whatever, God made the other nations swear that they wouldn't subjugate the Jews excessively. That is a wild claim because it is not borne out by much of Jewish history. And you can imagine how this debate comes to life in the latter part of the 19th century and the early part of the 20th century in the debates over Zionism. Like, is Zionism only about the spiritual revival of the Jewish people, or is it primarily or exclusively about creating a political new reality, a state for the Jews, which was really the Herzlian version of, or vision of Zionism? It was a political movement and not just a so you have Jews fighting against Jews, and the ultra-Orthodox, not surprisingly, by and large, reject political Zionism because they object to the master concept that encapsulates all of the objections of Rabbi Judah, which is known in Hebrew as dichikat haketz. Dichikat haketz literally means knocking or pushing on the end, where ketz means the end of all time. In other words, people or Jews taking matters into their own hand and pushing the timeline for the Messiah to come back. That's the religious objection here. That early anti-Zionists who were religious Jews objected to dichikat haketz, that if you create a movement to establish a political reality on the ground, you are dichikat haketz. You are engaging in pushing God's timeline for the Messiah when God has a plan and God will enact said plan in God's good, sweet time. And that it is not for you as a Jew, how chutzpahdik, how audacious of you as a Jew to think that you can take God's matters into your own hands and advance what is supposed to be a messianic timeline for reestablishing sovereignty in Eretz Yisrael. And by the way, this debate is still present today, though it's highly muted because Israel is a fact on the ground with international recognition for more than 75 years now. However, there are still communities, and interestingly, the one group of protesters that I heard about at the march, though I did not see them with my own eyes, were Niturei Karta, who were the most virulent anti-Zionists from within Jewish orthodoxy. They are the ones who always show up at any pro-Israel or pro-Palestinian rally, gathering, whatever, to stand by the sides of those who oppose the existence of the state of Israel, because on religious principle, they believe that the establishment of the state of Israel violates the will of God because we took matters into our own hand and we violated the divine decree that in God's sweet time, God will bring back the Messiah and God will establish a messianic theocracy in Eretz Yisrael, not the Jewish people establishing a secular democracy in Eretz Yisrael. So this is why I wanted to bring these texts to you today, because I wanted you to see that modern Zionism's, I would say, maybe the most important debate in the first decades of the modern Zionist movement or movements is actually a reflection of a passage from the Bablylonian Talmud and touches on the deep discord and paradox of what it means to be a Jew who lives in exile, but who also has an everlasting spiritual connection to one place, right? Getting back to the Kathy comment that led me to conclude you have to be a Jew requires you have a high threshold for paradox and internal cognitive dissonance. Okay, that's really the end of my lecture portion for today. It's what I wanted to get across. We'll have a little bit of time for a few questions, and so grateful to be back in the saddle with you. If you want to learn more about the history of Zionism and the conflict, whether or not you made it last Sunday, you won't be hopelessly lost. You may need a little bit of catching up to do. 11:45 to 1:15 in person with a live stream, but it's not Zoomed. It's a passive live stream. You can tune into the Temple website and watch the class unfolding, and it's a lot of lecture. It's not as interactive as I hope this class is. Okay, a few comments, and then we move on with our day. Kathy, mom and dad, and Eve and Aaron in that order.
So I'm reading Constantine's Sword, and it's really a history of anti-Semitism since, the birth of Christ. And one of the things, the Talmud was written about the time of Constantine's son, and then Augustus. And of course, the anti-Semitism was profound. Finally, Augustus said, let's not be too bad towards the Jews. Let's let them exist, because in fact, we need these Jews, because the Old Testament is what set up the story for the coming of Christ, in their opinion. But at that point, the Jews had been dispersed, and there was a kind of learned helplessness about it all. The Romans were still attacking. They wanted to be as quiet as possible and kind of, as much as possible, live side by side. That probably forced them into the ghettos. But who wanted to have their communities, just decimated by the Romans again, by drawing attention.
Yep, love that. I think that, the comment within the comment that I'll lift out is your attentiveness to Jewish learned helplessness by being in a prolonged, protracted state of exile. It is exactly that most of the Zionists, even those who did not support immigrating to Eretz Yisrael, many of the early Zionists were boldly rejecting the millennia-long story of Jewish learned helplessness. And it is also true, to extract from your observation through Constantine's Sword, great book, by the way, how different and varied the approaches were of various imperial, state, and church powers throughout European Jewish history. It is not a monolith. Jews tended to fare better in Muslim-governed lands than they did in Christian-governed lands. And the history of the Jews of the Iberian Peninsula, the Jews of Spain and Portugal, is direct testimony of just that. That generally when Muslim rulers were the governing power in the Iberian Peninsula, Jews were treated not as first-class citizens, but maybe as second-class citizens, because they were categorized as fellow people of the book, even if they rejected Muhammad as the one true prophet of God. And Jews tended to flourish, at least culturally, in those environments out of proportion to the way Jews fared in Christian-dominated communities. And what the church wanted to do with Jews, how subjugated will they be? It was always a matter of degree, right? Jews were never really given the opportunity to interact fully as a equal member of Western society, at least until the Enlightenment and Emancipation. And even that proved to be a fleeting dream not fully realized. That even as Jews were liberated by Napoleon from the ghettos and began to adapt to participating in modern society, we're talking in the very late 1700s, early 1800s, it would be less than a century, it would be half a century before Jews realized that the inbred anti-Semitism of Europe, both Western and Eastern, was not surmountable. Which is why you and your ancestors came to either America or Israel, or Eretz Yisrael, right? That is the Jewish story. Okay, Kathy, you just commented, so let's
commented. I'm
down.
down.
Mom and Dad?
Despite their objection to the political reality of the state of Israel, there was reporting that among the ultra-Orthodox who have military exemptions, there was a rush to enlist in the IDF. And so, your day-to-day ability to draw breath, I guess, takes precedence over these theories.
I talked about this with a young Israeli woman last night who was with my 11th and 12th grade Rabbi's table class, which was just fantastic. She's an 18-year-old on a year of service through the Jewish Agency to our community. So she's a Shinshinit. which means it's an acronym for Shnat Sherut, which means a year of public service. It's a gap year between high school. She graduated last year. She's 18. She'll be entering the IDF come September. But her name is Neulaufer. And she actually talked about how the Haredi community actually split after October 7th. So I wanted to make it very clear that the protesters against Israel, who were on the sidelines of the rally in very small numbers, but they're always loud with their megaphones and signs, represent a very small fraction of the Jewish world and even a fraction of the Haredi world, of the ultra-Orthodox world. Many ultra-Orthodox Jews, even those who deny the political legitimacy of the state of Israel, believe that murdering and butchering Jews requires a response above their religious objection to the legitimacy of the secular state of Israel. So 100% right. So we should not tar and feather or paint all Haredi Jews today with one brushstroke in response to the war. They may not become dyed-in-the-wool ideological Zionists. They may still object to the political legitimacy of the state of Israel today and not accept that its government is a legitimate government. And nevertheless, they believe that Israel must fight a war against Hamas because it's an existential threat, not just against Israel as a state, but against Jewish people, right? So you nailed that 100% in your observation. And a number of Haredi Jews are enlisting in the IDF, and they have special divisions which are created to accommodate the lifestyle, the Haredi way of life. It's really amazing, actually. I'm not saying it will produce a wholesale change, but there's been a shift. So when you have people who are like democracy protesters on October 6th, standing alongside significant numbers of Haredi Jews on October 8th, you get one more glimpse in what I believe is the most significant chapter in Jewish history in my lifetime, that you're living through it right now. And on that note, I have to conclude today's class. I'm really grateful for the opportunity to learn Talmud with you and also to apply Talmud. I hope that this diversion away from the ethics of war also felt relevant. And that's what I'm going to try to keep doing, is finding passages from the Babylonian Talmud, as I said, the first time we gathered after October 7th. Find the passages that really comment on the Jewish experience in light of what has happened since October 7th. So really grateful for this opportunity to be in dialogue with all of you, and wish you an early Shabbat Shalom. Thanks, everyone.
Shabbat Shalom.
Koyach, koyach.
Baruch Teh.